to business. They are in the process now of voting, and we know that that is a laborious process. That's one of the unknowns in any conclave. When exactly we will see the smoke. We have rough ideas of the time, but we expect that we have one vote tonight. We expect it'll likely be black smoke, unless there is a major, major surprise. But everyone here, of course, is gathered, which is something of a full-time sport when it comes to conclave among the Romans.
Well, for those members of the EWTN family that are joining us for the first time, I have here with me Monsignor Landry. He is the National Director of the Pontifical Mission Societies USA, Dr. Matthew Bunson, Editorial Director and Vice President of EWTN News, who you just heard from, and Hannah Brockhouse, a Vatican correspondent for EWTN News based here in Rome in our Vatican Bureau, and we will get to her for some color and some stories in a little bit. Let's go to prayer. It's what we do best. We pray together as a family. Let's start with a prayer from Father Joseph down in Hansville. Sorry, in Irondale.
O God, eternal shepherd, who govern your flock with unfailing care, grant in your boundless fatherly love a pastor for your church who will please you by his holiness and to show us watchful care. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. We know that we pray as a family, and we're living this moment as a family, watchfully anticipating the next steps for the seat of Peter. Monsignor Landry, we've had a busy day. How did it go?
So the day began with the Mass for the election of Roman Pontiff, and Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re celebrated a beautiful Mass in a packed basilica, and he preached a homily giving the major job qualification of the successor of St. Peter. It's exactly what we see sculpted in a bas-relief into the chair, in the altar of the chair, right underneath the Holy Spirit at the back of the basilica. It's to love others as Christ has loved us first. Remember, Jesus didn't say, love me as I have loved you, but love one another as I have loved you. And when he gave St. Peter the opportunity to repent of his previous trifold denial by a trifold acknowledgement of his love for the Lord, as soon as he said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter said, you know that I do. Jesus didn't say, great, I love you, you love me, we're one happy family. No, he didn't say that. He said, feed my sheep, feed my lambs, tend my sheep. Peter's love for Jesus would be shown in his love for the flock entrusted. And so that was the job description being put forward by Cardinal Re for whoever of the 133 electors most likely is going to be indicated as the 267th Peter.
And for those members of the EWTN family that weren't with us for that Mass, we're sorry that we missed you, but we do have the soundbite, the best soundbite, I would say, from that homily, straight from Cardinal Re's mouth.
This message of Jesus is connected to what we heard in the first reading of the Mass, in which the prophet Isaiah reminded us that the fundamental quality of shepherds is love to the complete gift of oneself.
Matthew, 91-year-old Cardinal Re.
He presided over the funeral of Pope Francis with almost shocking vigor and enthusiasm, and not that he was happy to bury him, but you could tell that he brought such energy to the role. We saw it again today. For somebody who's 91 years old, I said at the time of the funeral that apparently prayer, wine, and pasta is very conducive to a long life and a healthy life.
Absolutely. Well, we did have one more cardinal of the College of Cardinals, an elector, who kind of stood out in the way that he greeted everyone in the room in the Sistine, and that's Cardinal Pizzaballa. And we can show our audience, for those of you listening on radio who can't see this, he kind of said hello by putting his hand to his heart and doing a nice reverent bow. And that, I think, signaled his awareness that the laity and the faithful were in the room. It wasn't just a Mass for cardinals, but also I think that people have been following him. Hannah, you've done a lot of reporting on the Holy Father. You've been on papal planes. What are you hearing about Cardinal Pizzaballa?
Of course, he's very popular right now among Catholics. He's made a name for himself lately, but he didn't just arrive in the Holy Land. He's been there for over 30 years. been leading the church there. EWTN News had a really great interview with him actually back in 2020, right before he was named the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem. He had been Apostolic Administrator for 4 years already. But he said something I think is really interesting in that interview, besides saying that he has been completely changed by living in the Holy Land, most of his life now spent there, but that he said wherever Providence will bring him, he will bring the Holy Land. That's the impact that it's had on his life.
What have you heard, Monsignor Landry? We've talked about him a little bit in his background, but has any of that changed or come out into the forefront in the last couple of days?
A lot of the cardinals who didn't know him personally have had a chance to get to know him. His reputation preceded him, especially when he offered to take the place of all the children who were captive in Gaza, which really endeared him to everybody throughout the Holy Land. That type of courage is the courage of a shepherd who will lay down his life for a sheep. It's a condition of someone who really follows Jesus up close. He has tremendous leadership abilities. His English is great. His Italian is native. He likewise speaks Hebrew. He's shown in the Holy Land that he has the capacity to work against major debts. He inherited almost $100 million debt there in the Holy Land, and through some hard work, he eliminated it. The debt here in the Vatican is greater than that, but he's shown that he's not a coward before those challenges. The one thing people say negative is that he's too young at 60.
Is that the only thing?
Well, he has he has had to navigate a diplomatic minefield in the Holy Land, and he's done it throughout his time there as Custos, head of the Franciscans there, but then especially first as administrator and then as a Latin Patriarch. That, for some, the reality of the war there, some would question, has it been conducted, the diplomatic side, effectively? I would argue yes. So in terms of his diplomatic skill, I think he's already established himself as very capable in that regard. The other question, I think, is where does the Latin Patriarchate fit in the wider reality of the Middle East? And would he be able to assume the role of a universal peace broker? And I think that's one thing that they would ask. But again, I think he has demonstrated such remarkable qualities as Patriarch, building those bridges between the Israelis and the Latin Patriarchate, but the native Palestinian Christians love him very much. And I think he really has established himself quite formidably as a figure in the Middle East, and I think they're getting to know him much, much better here.
No, we're going to do something a little unusual for the past coverage, which has been quite pastoral, and kind of talk about the kind of votes that they would garner. So obviously, when you're thinking about the Eastern churches and those who want to have the Pope's ear for the persecuted church, you know that those electors that we featured from that region, I believe there's 5 of them, would be thinking about him as someone that he would be representative of them, thinking that he's Italian and kind of fits the bill there. Would he then have the 17 Italian electors? Now I'm starting to tally 25-something votes, right? So what do those blocks look like for him of people who are interested in a young Cardinal Pizzaballa?
Well, it's hard to predict blocks. You're almost never going to get 17 cardinal electors all on exactly the same page, or even 5 patriarchs exactly on the same page. So it's hard to know exactly the math. But at the same time, lots admire. The question is, we're longing for a time in which all 133 electors are all eligible.
Yes.
All of them have the qualifications. Many of the cardinals in the Sistine Chapel would serve very well as a Holy Father. The cardinals can only vote for one at a time. So the larger question is, do I think that with this person's skill set, this person's openness to cooperating with God, that this person is the man of the moment to lead the church, or do I think somebody else is a little bit stronger? And so those are the tough decisions. You can only vote for one at a time, whereas you might think multiple people would be good successors of St. Peter. So where he's going to fit into the ordinal rank of the cardinal electors is known only to God.
Yeah, there are 2 aspects worth thinking about. The first is what he arrives with. You know, is there a body of cardinals that is already predisposed and ready to vote for him? And in the first ballot tonight, there's a lot of very interested electors trying to figure out, for example, where does Cardinal Parolin fall? Where does Pizzaballa fall on this first ballot? Then the question is, all right, if he, say, garners, hypothetically, 15, 20 cardinals, where does that go in the second ballot? Does he go up? Does he go down? And as other cardinals perhaps rise and decline in votes, where does he fit into that as well? And are they looking at him as a potential compromise down the road, that someone they could build around to reach a consensus? It's always going to be a math problem. You have to get to 89. But in order to do that, you have to build something of a coalition of moderates, of moderate conservatives, and moderate liberals.
I don't necessarily want to use those political terms for that. Right. I know that some people do, but I do think that there are some issues that came up during the general congregations that give us some guidance about what everyone is actually looking for. Obviously, listening to the homily and the original scriptural description of what the Holy Father is supposed to be versus what we're looking for in temporal realities. Hannah, to kind of put a bow on our small analysis of Cardinal Pizzaballa, from a personal perspective, when you think about the coverage of him and what you've had to report on, what stands out the most, or what do you think is notable that you haven't heard talked about with him?
Well, everything that we said so far is obviously incredibly relevant. I think the age is a significant factor, unfortunately, and maybe the Cardinals don't want him to leave the Holy Land. He's doing a really great job there, and maybe they think that more years there would be good, that he keeps leading the church there.
Because it was so hard to fill that seat. I know that's something that we noted earlier, Monsignor Landry, definitely. Well, moving on to later events in the day, this has been a day full of all kinds of beautiful acts of piety, acts of devotion. We had this oath that everyone had to take. We watched every single cardinal put their hand on scripture and say, "This is my moment. I will pledge to do this right, so help me God." And we know that one of those men who took that oath, as we watched as a family that moment, is going to come out of that balcony. We do have Jorge Mario Bergoglio's oath that we can share with our EWTN family. Let's take a look at that and see what that looked like back then.
From 2013.
Tego Georgius Marius Cardinalis Bergoglio spondio voveo adiuro sic me Deus adiuvet et ac Sancta Dei Evangelia quae manum mea tango.
A weighty moment, one that I'm sure he probably didn't even realize we were recording and looking at and praying with. What do you think was going through his head?
I think he was taking his vow seriously because of who the man was. I don't think he was looking ahead in terms of what might come to him. I think he was trying to give himself wholly into what he was praying and publicly declaring at that moment. It is one of the things about the sincerity that always struck us in the future Pope Francis as he made those remarks. Nobody quite knows. He was being mentioned. He had already been the major runner-up in 2005. And so he had been there before. He had made it. He had kept his word. He was doing it again. Who knows what would happen in history? And I think there's a question mark behind every cardinal who says those words with an exclamation point. The exclamation point, they mean everything, but they're likewise wondering if they're going to be the sole person who can give exceptions to sharing what happens in the Sistine Chapel as the next successor of St. Peter.
Absolutely. And that, I think that's remarkable. Well, watching that, Hannah, you've been here in Rome for almost 9 years, reporting specifically on this past pontificate that just ended. What is your initial reaction to what you lived on the papal plains, etc., and what you reported on? How has that changed you?
Well, despite reporting on the funeral and the events of these last weeks, I have to say it still feels a little surreal because he's been the Pope while I've been working in this job and covering it so closely. I think until that the new Pope steps out on the balcony, it won't quite be real for me that he is no longer our Pope. But it's been a wonderful almost 9 years now, and I have so many personal memories of him as well, from papal trips and from here in Rome. One I was reflecting on today because I often think about and speak about how the COVID-19 pandemic really affected him and how being kind of hidden away from the people was hard for him. Was getting to be at his first public audience after that had started to blow over. It had been 6 months since he had given a general audience with people present. He had started to do it on video, but he hadn't giving his message, but he hadn't been present with people. And we had just a few days notice. So all the people that were there, we were actually inside the Vatican in a smaller courtyard, not in St. Peter's Square as usual, were mostly just completely surprised. Even some of them that morning found out, oh, I can go in here and I can see the Pope. And it was such an intimate moment. There were just a few hundred people there. It was remarkable.
Very different from today, where you have thousands of reporters just descending on Rome and the Vatican and getting in your way. Because you're here day to day, year after year, doing this important reporting for EWTN. How has that dynamic been? Are you welcoming everyone? Are you kind of asking them to move over?
Well, it's fun. It's fun to have colleagues, especially from many of us stationed here. There are friends that we actually meet over the years that now are back in Rome again to cover this momentous occasion. So that part of it is fun. And, you know, we have a little bit of the upper hand because we know how the system works. We know how Italy works and the Holy See Press Office. So that gives us a bit of an advantage sometimes. But, you know, we're also used to rubbing shoulders with the secular press on papal trips. I mean, it's the same thing. And our colleagues will ask us questions and lean into us for expertise. So the same sort of thing is happening now.
How's your reporting different from the reporting that you would do were you a reporter at a secular media company rather than an apostolate that's focused on communicating the truth of the church to the world?
Yeah, well, I'm really grateful that at EWTN I can bring my faith to my job. That's so important to me, especially doing this, that I'm a Catholic first and a reporter second. So the fact that I can be a Catholic reporter and telling these stories that are personally important to me, not just for my job, it means a lot.
There's one story in particular that I saw in the Catholic News Agency reporting that I found curious and endearing, and also a mark of what you're talking about in terms of that intimacy with covering the Vatican. Talking about the chef for the conclave. There's a menu. There is intention around what is going to be served. Tell us about that.
Sure, apart from spiritual needs, the Cardinals obviously have temporal needs as well during this time, a place to rest and food to eat. So it's interesting to think about, right? And of course, Italians take food extremely seriously. So I'm not surprised that there's an Italian chef who is carefully crafted and is thinking about how will certain kinds of food affect their digestion, which could affect their thinking and their sleepiness as they're going through the voting in the Sistine Chapel. So I found that quite interesting as well.
No carb loading after the first vote?
Exactly. No. But I did think it was interesting that the chef said no American breakfast, no eggs and bacon. They should have toast and jam, sort of an Italian staple instead.
Yeah, and like a fruit as their dolce, which, what a jip.
Yeah.
Especially during the Easter season.
I know. We just, a little tiramisu, just a little.
Well, remember, the history of conclaves, they're starving them to get them to get their task done.
They'll be able to celebrate afterward, right?
Oh,
yeah.
I think that'll be encouragement for them to get it all done. Well, as we're sitting here waiting, let's talk about another candidate that has come to the forefront in different ways than Cardinal Pizzaballa, and that's Cardinal Erdo of Hungary. Matthew, what can you tell us about him, his background, I think we can mention some of the ways that he fits the profile of what was discussed in the general congregations.
Yeah, so he is one of the John Paul II cardinals, so he was very young when he was named to the cardinalate. He is one of the most respected canonists or experts in canon law anywhere in the entire church. Brilliant mind, brilliant academic. He has been the Archbishop of Esztergom, Budapest for quite a number of years. He has really established himself not just in the Eastern European episcopate, but across the European episcopate, and he is extremely well known here in Italy. He is, I think it is safe to say, among the more, I hate to use those political labels, but among the conservative cardinals, he is by far the key figure for them heading into this conclave. He is the one I think that they would eagerly support. The question before him is, can he sort of expand the number of cardinals who perhaps don't know him yet, who might have someone more in mind in sort of continuity with Pope Francis. Not that he was opposed to Pope Francis in any way, but that's one of the big questions overall in the conclave. The other thing that he brings, I think, is this wealth of bridge building among, as I was just mentioning, the European bishops, who at times have seemed somewhat divided within themselves, and building real consensus. So that is an art that I think has been somewhat overlooked in him as the Archbishop there.
Monsignor Landry, would you add something about Cardinal Erdo that Matthew hasn't mentioned?
He's a very ordered and organized man. So with regard to running an institution like the Archdiocese of Esztergom, Budapest, or the Vatican, I don't think that that would be particularly overwhelming for him. I do think that if across the panoply of European bishops and bishops' conferences, they would find him the most fit leader, not just once, but after seeing him in action a second time, a second term of 10 years, 5 years, excuse me, for 10 years total, it is important for the cardinals across the globe, who are, again, across a whole spectrum of priorities, would be able to get to know him so that they might discover in him what the bishops of Europe had already found. I don't think the pontificate of Pope Francis allowed those opportunities because he wasn't convening the cardinals for meetings like his predecessors did. We'll see if in the general congregations he had that type of exposure. He's not the most gregarious person. He's not really going to work a room. He's very studious, very smart, kind when you meet him, but at the same time, people are going to more approach him than the other way around. And so we'll see what happened during the general congregations at the end of the conclave and see what color he comes out with.
I think that 7 is really a perfect number. When we were doing the analysis of the general congregations, we realized there really were 7 things that came up over and over again, which, is an interesting fact, I think. And one of those was that knowledge of canon law. Another one was continuity in that understanding of evangelization, where I think, Matthew, one of the points that you were making, I would say that it was a focus on going out for the one to the detriment of the 99. That lack of clarity in church teaching and reiterating the magisterium of the church for those who may not be as well steeped or well formed when we think about Christendom really being over. We know that Monsignor Shea from the University of Mary wrote this essay really describing how we've been infused with this knowledge of Christianity as something that we all share, having a common language, biblical background. That's gone. That's gone, and social media has so perpetuated this reality that now we have to think about even forming those who claim the church for themselves. Knowing that, there is something else that I think falls into the camp of a Erdo candidacy, which is that he is from a country that has a very powerful and influential, rising powerful and influential government similar to the United States. Hannah, do you think that that comparison is a fair one and one that has been circulating as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, the country that these cardinals come from is a huge consideration. And some people have said that he comes from Hungary could work against him, actually.
Well, we know that we have Colin Flynn, our intrepid reporter in the crowds, who is going to bring us some flavor of the huge number of people that have gathered here to start this chimney watch. Colin, what are you seeing?
Monsi, hello, and before we start this, by the way, I have to point out, there are so many people down here from all over the world. We had to come right down the street because the crowds are so jam-packed up near St. Peter's Square. TV crews from all over the world are actually having a problem getting their signals back. So if we break up a bit, it's just because of the sheer amount of people here all using their mobile phones. But me, like the tens of thousands of people, we are staring at what is the most famous chimney in the world now, and the most famous seagull as well above it, waiting to see the smoke. Will it be black? Will it be white? We're all waiting to see, and there are people here from all over the world. I was talking to a couple, said hello to them from China a moment ago. Over here, we just said hello. Where are you from?
Germany.
You're from Germany?
Barbados.
Barbados.
Brazil.
Brazil. And your students here, what are you studying?
Italian.
Italian, okay. How's it going? Good?
Oh, it's going great. We're in the center of Rome. What could go wrong? A little bit.
You're Catholic as well.
Yeah.
Why is this moment special for you?
Yeah, because it's like one of a lifetime experience.
It is
and
one of a lifetime.
I mean, we're living in history right now, right?
We're just here, like we were, like
We're
in the
Rome,
other.
We can't not be here.
So you're excited to see some smoke?
Yeah, of course.
We might have to wait till tomorrow, but who knows?
Well, Colum, I think that we lost you for a second there. We'll come back to you. We know that you're getting some wonderful reactions of young people and families, some who have come specifically for this moment, as we know that we saw an interview yesterday with a young woman who was very enthusiastic about her Pope watch. But I think also the young people who are here studying, we talked about seminarians, all of that is this electric feeling of anticipation for what comes next. Well, there are other candidates that are being considered, one of which we heard a lot about, which is Cardinal Parolin. What can you tell us that we haven't heard, Monsignor Landry, about this very prominent cardinal who's the senior-most cardinal, right, in the college?
Among the electors,
yes.
He's the senior cardinal. I had the chance to get to know Cardinal Parolin fairly well when I was working for the Holy See at the United Nations. Every 2 years he would come and head the delegation of the Holy See to the United Nations. And he's a very prayerful man. He's a real gentleman. He's a man who knows the faith very well and is able to order means toward ends. He's very clear in terms of what those ends need to be. People have, in general, very much liked to work alongside of him and for him. He is not the most charismatic figure. He preaches very, very well, but not necessarily what we would call with passion. The teaching is super clear. He reminds a lot of the people who listen to him a little bit of Pope Benedict. He's always got something important to say, but he doesn't always say it in the necessarily most eloquent delivery. Other people think that he reminds us a lot of Pope St. Paul VI in personality and demeanor, in approach to various subjects. And so not everybody's reporting on that. Many will report his trajectory here, that he was the nuncio in Venezuela, for example. He's very capable in multiple languages. Many will report that he negotiated for Pope Benedict the original outline of a deal with China. And then Pope Francis basically took that and implemented it. A lot of people will say that that was Cardinal Parolin's work. Cardinal Parolin was an instrument of that work. And I think we do have to keep that in mind when we look at the troubling situation for Christians in China. But he is the man being mentioned by far the most because of his prominence in the pontificate of Pope Francis, but then also his capability of looking at the scope of the challenges in the world and trying to integrate them into a step-by-step process to bring the church forward.
Hannah, what have you seen?
Well, I wanted to add that he also has a really good relationship with the Vatican journalists, the Vaticanisti. I think that's interesting, looking at how Pope Francis was so prominent in the media and his pontificate and the way that he interacted with journalists in the media. And I think we could see Parolin having a little bit of the same effect then as Pope Francis did.
Where
very
he's
good
not
in that
afraid
area.
of the interviews. Yeah. Matthew, when you look at what came up in the general congregations, you had canon law, which Cardinal Parolin has experience with. You have the role of the Roman Curia, right? Vatican affairs is something that came up over and over again, as well as this pursuit of peace, diplomatic skills, the ability to really get in there, which we know he has as well and experience with, and then the continuity with the other pontificates. So he's checking 4 of the 7 really important boxes. Would you say that that makes sense for you, that analysis?
Yeah, I do. I think his career, his ministry has spanned all of those pontificates. So he studied at the Pontifical Ecclesiastical Academy. He served under John Paul II. He served under Benedict. He was very respected under Benedict, came in under Francis, who was looking for a particular kind of Secretary of State, and he found him, having Cardinal Bergoglio dealt with Parolin for many years in Latin America. The other advantage that he does bring instantly in any conclave is that over those years, because of his role as Secretary of State, he has had encounters with the vast number of these bishops and archbishops, these cardinals who are now taking part here. And so as name recognition goes, but it's beyond that, they have actually had a chance to see him at work and to make their assessments. He's also well known, obviously, within the Roman Curia. Some may have strong opinions about him in one direction or the next, but he's certainly not an unknown figure. As Monsignor was saying, the China deal is a potential complication for him because some hold him responsible for that. Some would also question how far he was allowed to function in his role as Secretary of State, because as we know, Pope Francis liked to keep things very close to himself. In terms of a peace side, Cardinal Zuppi of Bologna was more of Pope Francis's personal delegate to try to achieve peace in Ukraine, bypassing the Secretary of State. The last thing that is worth noting, and this is one of the boxes that we were looking at in terms of our analysis, is a pastoral capacity. He would become the first Secretary of State to be elected Pope since Eugenio Pacelli in 1939. So we're going back some distance.
Pope Pius XII.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you for the translation.
So Pacelli won in 3 ballots. We'll see if Cardinal Parolin, if he does win, can do it in 3 ballots. I would say that within the body of cardinals, he doesn't have the same stature that Pacelli brought to bear. But the world is also in crisis, and that's something that may redound to his favor. But the absence of a long-standing pastoral experience could also give some cardinals pause before they vote for him.
Yeah, I mean, that was the fourth dimension that was mentioned, and one that came up again and again in the homilies, both the Novendiales homilies as well as the last two that we heard, these real kind of exhortations of the Holy Spirit, asking for someone who will communicate the faith to the faithful around the world and bring in more, go out in the missionary sense. And so he doesn't really tick that box. But you never know how, Monsignor, you were saying, the Holy Spirit will qualify the called. Could he rediscover that?
There's a difference between pastoral experience and pastoral personality.
Exactly.
Sometimes people have all the pastoral skills that would be necessary, but they've been asked to do a particular service for the church in which those aren't going to be featured as much as, for example, in his case, his intelligence and his prudence in being able to lead the Church Universal. And so, having known Cardinal Parolin, I have no doubt that he's got real pastoral skills, even though he hasn't been in the assignment for those pastoral skills to shine as some of the other cardinals with him now in the Sistine Chapel.
His homily on the day after the funeral, this is the Mass for the Jubilee. Some didn't like it. They thought it was a little bland, or he didn't bring a lot of energy to it. I would reject that criticism. I personally thought it was theologically rich. I thought it was delivered in a very pastoral way, knowing his audience. He knew that he was talking to young people, so it was a patient kind of a homily. So in that sense, I think he at least established the capacity for talking to young people, which is essential as we move forward in the life of the church.
Monsignor Landry, what does his age do for him?
I think his age at 70 is not going to disqualify him. He struggled with a few health issues over the course of time, particularly some non-cancerous things that had to be removed. He's not a particularly athletic or vigorous man, so he's steady. But so those would be some questions that people would have, but he would not be ruled out because he's 70, which is in the sweet spot that a lot of cardinals are looking for, at least 70. And I think people would love to have somebody who might be like the former Cardinal Bergoglio, who, until he ended up in a wheelchair, was crisscrossing the world with just an intrepid will. You don't see the same thing in Cardinal Parolin, so that won't be as impressive, but I don't think he's disqualified at all because of his age.
Hannah, is it true that the pace of the Francis papacy was noted over and over and over again by journalists covering that pontificate?
It was remarkable. I mean, it's surprising for me. I don't know how he did it. Like some of the trips that he went on, I know I was with him in Thailand and Japan, and that was before he had to start slowing his schedule down a bit, and just the number of speeches and places he would go in one day. It was back to back to back. I mean, to me, it seems like the man never rested.
Well, I know that that's something that you saw modeled in John Paul II. Pope Benedict, it's not that he didn't travel. It was a different way of executing the office and kind of being at home as well and providing us with the intellectual tradition that was so lacking for so many years. And I think in a way that was just pastoral as well with some of the letters that he wrote. Pope Francis then kind of was a mix of all things, writing a lot and traveling a lot, but also praying a lot. These have to be men who pray. How would we characterize the last three candidates electors that we spoke about in terms of prayer and devotion and modeling that for the world?
They all have those reputations. When Cardinal Parolin was appointed, one of the things that those in the diplomatic corps who knew him best said about him is he's a very prayerful nuncio who was coming here. They wouldn't say that about every nuncio. Other nuncios would be super hard workers, you name it, but they wouldn't necessarily say that. But they all said that in one voice about Cardinal Pietro Parolin. On last week's day off, Cardinal Pizzaballa, rather than doing anything, just took it as a retreat day and prayed the entire day. And many of those who know him up close in the Holy Land talk about his prayer life. Likewise, Cardinal Erdo similarly has a reputation for being quite prayerful. We would hope that every priest, every bishop, every cardinal would be distinguished above all by an existence-made prayer. That's the most important thing they do. And it's been impressive with these three figures that they really have made it a priority.
One of the individuals that you mentioned, Matthew, that I think is worth diving into, particularly because of what you mentioned about this promotion of peace and diplomatic capacity, is Cardinal Zuppi. What can you tell us about him within those categories we've discussed?
Yeah, well, he ticks a lot of the boxes. He obviously was Francis's chosen person to be a diplomat. He's Archbishop of Bologna. He is extremely well known, obviously, within the Italian Church. He's president of the Italian Bishops' Conference, a position that has proven to be a challenge given the post-synodal, the application of synodality in the Italian Church. How he has handled that, I think some have questioned his capacity to sort of build that consensus. But Cardinal Zuppi is also somebody who has tried to build consensus in other areas. He has tried to be somewhat non-controversial, for example, in the application of fiducia supplicans. He is also well known, and Hannah, you can talk about this, living here, for his relationship with the Sant'Egidio community, which is very prominent in Italy and is in 70 countries around the world. He's, again, somebody who has a Roman connection, having served here for many years before heading out, especially to Bologna. He is considered to be intellectually well-formed. He is a good writer. His positioning really does stake out ground, to use those political terms again that we hate to, but we have to in this case, among the moderates. He really has tried to project a moderate disposition, especially in so many of the controversies that have attended, shall we say, the pontificate of Pope Francis.
What would you add to that, Hannah, knowing Cardinal Zuppi and watching him over the years?
Yeah, I can provide a little bit of the Italian perspective as sort of an honorary Italian. Matthew mentioned how he's very well known among the Italian church, but also just among Italians. I think that's really significant. You know, you'll see him make appearances in Rome at cultural events. For example, he's a very sought-after speaker. So he is well known, I would say, among all Italians, not only those who are practicing their faith and paying attention to ecclesiastical affairs and discussions.
Is that a name that you've heard also mentioned as part of this list of potentials? At 69 years old, he also fits that age range that some would be interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. As far as Italians go, and I guess people that, you know, cardinals that are serving in Italy, let's say, not only Italian by birth, probably his name is the top of the list besides Parolin.
What would you add, Monsignor Landry?
He's got the reputation for being one of the nicest guys in the church. Everybody likes him. He's super charming. He's friendly. He remembers names. He's super personal. As the president of the Italian Bishops' Conference, you have to basically keep the whole team together. So he does have this personality to be able to find common ground among his brothers. That's always an advantage. And he had experience as a pastor here in the city of Rome of one of the most vibrant parishes, Santa Maria in Trastevere. And so that's one of the reasons why people look to him. If you're saying you want to have pastoral experience, he's one that just doesn't have experiences good and bad. He has experiences that were quite thriving here across the generations, but particularly with the young and those who might not be considered pious, in bringing them to try to encounter God through sacred music, through sacred art, through literature, through good preaching. And so he's got those chops, and everybody, no matter whether they would agree with him on particular theological takes, etc., everybody gives him that credibility for sure. He was probably the most mentioned Italian prior to the death of the Holy Father. Since then, he hasn't been mentioned nearly as much. One of the reasons could be that while everybody else was staying here, he was traveling back and forth to Bologna to be able to sort of lead his archdiocese and solve some issues up there that he had to tackle. And so whether that will help him or hurt him among his brother cardinals is for them to determine. But
now, Matthew, when it comes to canon law, Vatican affairs, I mean, he seems to tick some of the other boxes, missionary ability, communications ability, but not necessarily canon law, Vatican affairs. What do you see there?
Well, as the Archbishop of one of the most prominent of the Italian archdioceses, he certainly had to deal with his fair share of canonical issues. But in terms of being like a formidable canonist, that certainly isn't his reputation. He's certainly more of a theologian than he would be a canon lawyer expert.
Well, let's go to Column out in the square again. Well, now not even in the square. I think you've seen so many Starlinks. I really feel like Elon Musk is going to make an appearance here at some point just to promo the fact that that's what we're all using to try to make sure that we can communicate with the outside world, which is a little odd to encounter that over the pond, right? Yeah. But here we are. Column, tell us what you're seeing. Is there anyone there that that you can introduce to us from our faithful who are waiting for that chimney to have some smoke? And again, that very famous seagull.
Yeah, this seagull, I want to get a photograph, a selfie with that seagull. I don't know if a seagull can give an autograph, but if it can, I'm going to order one of those because that seagull has been watched by people all over the world now. And I'm standing with Jacob Stein. He works for EWTN. In fact, when you see really cool things on the EWTN social media, Jacob is normally the man behind it. He's from Nebraska in the United States. Jacob, you've been looking at the stats on social media. How much interest is there in that chimney and what's about to happen and what it signifies?
It's exciting. We on social media, we're trying to get the content out there as quickly as we can consume it ourselves. And the reaction is very positive, very loving. People are waiting. They're waiting with anticipation as we're all staring. People who aren't Catholic, people who are Catholic, we want to just see the smoke.
Even for people who are not Catholic and people of other religions and no faith at all, do you think that they look at it and say, well, this is just the pageantry, the beauty, or do they have a sense that there's something deeper here? Are they getting that?
Well, I think it's important. Social media has this way of attracting with beauty right away. Imagery, music, the beauty of the written word as well. And people are hungry for that. And so they see the beauty of the rites, the liturgies. We talked about this in our live shows today on EWTN. They see the beauty and they're attracted to it. And it can be that first sort of interest.
The hook people, the hook, yeah.
And hopefully we can, hopefully we're able, especially the interest of Pope Francis on the international level, hopefully the new Pope also kind of will be able to respond to the needs and the questions that people have as well.
Jacob, you're fantastic. And in case there's any doubt about his credentials, they're all here. We'll talk to you in a moment. I see these wonderful ladies here. Now, they're backing away, but I'll back with them. How are you, my friend?
Oh, we're so excited about being here. This is a historical moment.
Where are you from?
From Panama.
From Panama?
Yes.
Oh, wow. That's a long way away.
Yes.
Did you come here for tourism or are you here for this event?
Actually, we went to Lourdes for a pilgrimage.
Beautiful.
And then it coincided that it just happened that the conclave was going to be here while we were here going on our way back.
Isn't that the work of the Holy Spirit?
It is.
The Holy Spirit was your travel guide.
Yes,
your tour operator.
Totally.
And how does it feel to be standing here? I know we've been here for quite a while looking at that chimney, but what are you feeling inside?
Oh, we're so excited that, we don't get tired, we don't mind. I mean, this is a historical moment, as I said, and a very emotional moment for us.
Because of what it signifies, that a new leader of our faith.
Exactly. And today we visited Pope Francis.
Oh, the tomb.
The tomb.
How was that?
It was fantastic because of the simplicity, the clean feeling of just the marble and his name.
Franciscus in Latin.
Franciscus in Latin, just his name, simple like he was. It was wonderful.
Humility, the message of humility, that he is living to us an example. His life the example that he wants to send to the new Pope and the Cardinals. That
it's beautiful.
The church should be simple.
Well, you know what, ladies, thank you so much for talking to me. I know we didn't plan this, but I saw you smiling and you were radiating so much warmth and friendliness. I wanted to come over and say hi. And as I was chatting to you, I felt a little bit cross-eyed because I'm watching you, but I'm also watching the chimney like everyone else. So we will wait and see. And for the moment, our beautiful friends all the way from Panama coming here through Lourdes. Monsi, will hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Colin. Wow, what a beautiful, beautiful providential movement for them to be called, to be in Lourdes and then to come here and be a part of this moment, which I know we all feel so privileged to be here. Let's continue on our path of the analysis of our wonderful electors who could potentially be the ones that get announced after we see smoke at some point over the next couple of days. God willing, not too many days. We'll be waiting in anticipation, and I know the Cardinals are going to want to go home too.
We're watching the chimney now.
That's exactly right. Well, one cardinal that really made a big debut in the United States with the National Eucharistic Congress is Cardinal Tagle, who was sent over as the envoy to represent the Holy Father and bring us into this moment of Eucharistic love. 60,000 people on their knees. You could hear a pin drop in that moment last summer. It was just incredible, and I do credit that and that move from the bishops for the revival that we're seeing around the country, and I would argue around the world. All of these young communities, especially this Easter, we saw reporting out of France and out of different countries in Europe and also in Africa, people coming into the church, being confirmed, being baptized in Belgium after the Holy Father's visit. It was just incredible to see. The pictures just speak for themselves. So Cardinal Tagle, he's known as someone who smiles a lot. He's kind of gone viral on social media. And Hannah, I don't know what you can tell us about what you've seen with the comments online and how young people react to him.
Well, he was really popular during the Synod on Youth. I mean, he kind of was, I guess, just popular among the young people that were taking part in the Synod on youth and young people. And I know there was sort of a dance party at one point and maybe a dance video, if I recall correctly. So I just know my very first impressions of him, I ran into him by chance once in Rome when he had just arrived, and he was extremely cordial and kind. So he's definitely a popular person. Yes,
and he's not American, but he is American educated, right, Matthew?
Yes, he is. His doctorate in theology, sacred theology, is from the Catholic University of America. His formation academically, and this is sort of inside baseball, but it does matter where he's concerned.
Everything matters at this point.
He's very much somebody schooled in what is called the Bologna School of interpreting the Second Vatican Council, and we can talk more about that. Basically, it is a school of thought that approaches the Second Vatican Council as more of a rupture from the past than continuity. So it's just one little facet to consider as we look at how he might interpret and then implement his vision for the Second Vatican Council, which for us as a church is still a lived experience, and the process of implementation is going to be crucial. He has long pastoral experience, having served in the Philippines as the Archbishop in particular of Manila, and then was brought here to become prefect for the dicastery now for evangelization. He ran into some difficulties, obviously, with the way the Caritas Internationalis unfolded because of some of the financial problems that it had. And then he found himself somewhat demoted, you might say, by Pope Francis to become pro-prefect for the dicastery for evangelization. But that wasn't his fault. Pope Francis, in his reorganization of the Roman Curia under the important document Predicate Evangelium, which reformed the whole of the Roman Curia, essentially Francis made himself prefect of the dicastery, which is his right. So from that standpoint, it's been a rough couple of years for Cardinal Tagle, and in some ways the hits just keep coming. His name really did surface almost immediately after Pope Francis's passing, but we haven't heard that much about him for about the last 10 days or so.
Hannah, what have you heard?
Well, regarding the Caritas situation, by all means, when he was demoted, he had an extremely humble and gracious response because it wasn't a great moment for him. And at the beginning, there wasn't a lot of information either for us journalists about what was going on internally there. But he really took it for the team there.
He did, yes.
Yeah. And I think that's something that we have tried to look for. We talked about the situation in Canada and how the Holy Father came and really represented that mercy and love that is necessary. So taking one for the team is not necessarily a bad thing when you're looking for someone who can be a representative and a diplomat. He seems to check a couple of these boxes.
Cardinal Tagle is one of the best preachers in the Catholic Church. He's had the reputation of being that good since at least 2005. He's got likewise the reputation of being a very poor administrator at Caritas Internationalis and in Manila, of not being particularly forthright, especially in prophetically calling the government of Duterte, which was sending out hit squads on people, they needed to turn to other voices in order to condemn that. He did defend the church's teachings when it came to some of the teachings on sexuality, when the Filipino government was trying to push things contrary to human good. I have always enjoyed very much my time with Cardinal Tagle. The first time I met him, he pulled one of the greatest practical jokes I've ever suffered. And I'll just never forget him for that. He's a guy who is able to do those types of things. Sometimes you say that you just want to be around somebody who's infectiously joyful. That is Cardinal Tagle. If he were the face of the Catholic Church, the face would have a big smile. Sometimes he's criticized because when he preaches, he gets emotional and he often weeps. I don't really think that that's a problem when someone's preaching. It would be a problem if he were meeting against dictators that he's crying in their midst. Unfortunately, yesterday, sometimes when you're a front runner, various people who don't want you to win put out hit pieces on you. And in the Italian press, there was a hit piece on Cardinal Tagle yesterday accusing him through avatars or pseudonyms of gambling in Macau with 5 anonymous sources. I think we need to be ready for that type of potential disinformation. I wouldn't give much weight there at the 11th hour, but it does show that certain people were concerned that Tagle would be elected and didn't want that eventuality. We have to be as wise as serpents in the way that we digest that type of information, waiting for the other side, just out of justice.
In much the same way that the rumor began about some health scare for Cardinal Parolin.
That's right.
Yeah, last week, that the Holy See press office simply absolutely just rejected out of hand. I mentioned Cardinal Parolin also because we talked about him as somebody who has a global profile. Well, in his role as prefect and then pro-prefect for evangelization, Cardinal Tagle is somebody who is extremely well known in the developing parts of the church, the younger parts of the church. So that relationship with all of those cardinals from places like Africa and Asia, he's obviously extremely already well known in Asia. Those could redound to his benefit when it comes to trying to decide who they would vote for in a conclave.
What do you see as his experience of applying synodality? That's something that came up. There were quite a few conversations around that in the general congregation, and it's a place where I haven't really been able to put my finger on.
He has a reputation of very much supporting Pope Francis's general line on synodality. He's never given a critical remark of that. Personally, he's a listener. He always wanted to involve, especially the poor, in the decisions that were being made when he was first a bishop in his native Imus in the Philippines. So I think if somebody were looking for a cardinal who would continue the synodal developments under the pontificate of Pope Francis, Cardinal Tagle would be somebody who would step on the gas pedal rather than slam the brakes.
Now, Matthew, I think this is something that we've discussed in the past when we're thinking about the number of faithful around the world. It was quite remarkable to have the first ever Latin American pope, a pope that represented a block of faithful that is first, second, when you put them together in the world of the number of Catholics.
Right.
When you look at Asia and the Asian bloc, the number of faithful in the Philippines, what would that do in terms of bringing a light to a place where the faith is growing rather than falling apart?
Yeah, it would have an enormous impact on the global church. If we thought that Pope Francis is a Latin American, but he was a Latin American from Argentina, he had close ties to Italy, this would be a pretty radical departure in papal history, certainly modern papal history. So I think it would also be a recognition of the remarkable growth of the church across Asia. And this is one of the fastest growing parts of the church in much the same way that Africa is. But Asia also brings with it such a diversity of experiences for the church. We have the persecutions in China. We have trying to deal with the multicultural realities of places like Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. And then we have the Philippines, which is, 90% Catholic. It has 98 million Catholics, I think, by our analysis. For him to come from that environment to become the Holy Father, I think would have long ramifications for the continued growth of the church in that part of the world.
And a place where the church is persecuted in some ways and has challenges that I think would resonate with other places in the world that others would categorize as developing, right?
Yes. Yeah, I'd want to add to what Matthew was saying, that the Filipinos are the new Irish. The Filipinos are everywhere. It's the third most populous Catholic country, but because especially of the Filipino prowess in fishing, they're all over the world in that industry. And in the service industries, in the nursing profession, Filipinos are literally everywhere. And so if there were a Filipino Pope, we would begin to notice just what type of leaven Filipino Catholics are all across the globe. When you're looking at the places in, for example, Scandinavia, that are growing in terms of the number of Catholics, a little part of that are the conversions of those who come from those countries, but the vast growth is coming because Filipinos have arrived and are really doing so many of the support industries there. And as a result, in all these places, there's a need for English masses in order to be able to serve the burgeoning, still, Filipino Catholic community. And so that would be a tremendous honor to this community, which is one of the most important in the church in 2025.
I want to take this opportunity just to say hello to our family watching around the world, listening on radio, because I know so many of our viewers come from the church in the Philippines. And so just a very warm hello to all of you. So grateful that you're with us, that you pray with us, and that in this moment we are going to receive the news of the successor to the seat of Peter together as one. So thank you for being so faithful to us and for sharing this beautiful heart that I know Mother Angelica, I think her heart would explain, but it's certainly translated for those who were in the audience that day.
That's what everybody said, as somebody who was present there when he made the connection between the Eucharist and mission, that Jesus in the Eucharist is literally giving of himself to us, trying to transform us from the inside so that we will make the same self-gift to others. That's what we heard in the homily on Sunday from Dominique Mamberti about the gift of self. Cardinal Tagle is someone who not only preaches that way, but tries to live that way, that from the Eucharist, he wants to go on out. The Eucharist is intentionally, he preached, missionary, that gets us to say in our own body language, this is my body, this is my blood, these are my calloused hands, this is my sweat, these are even my tears, offered out of love for you.
Well, the body of Christ coming together in St. Peter's, watching this chimney that is, again, the most famous chimney in the world, is represented in the individuals coming here who want to watch and listen and pray together. Colum, let's go back to you and continue this conversation with those out in the square.
Monsi, yeah, we are standing here in anticipation just as you are now. I'm enjoying the show, listening to it in my earpiece. People are still continuing to gather, and I just can't really explain how many people are packed into St. Peter's Square up there, and then the street leading all the way down to where our colleagues are broadcasting in Spanish and in Polish. There is a great atmosphere. People are in good form. There are a lot of families here. You have the buggies out and the small kids running around, and everyone is just staring so sharply, focusing so hard on that chimney. And then around us as well, Monse, I have to say, as someone who's worked in media for 20 years now at this stage, I have never seen so many networks, so many cameras, so many radio stations, which I think is a testament to us and our faith and to the power that the church still has in people's lives all over the world. It's an incredible moment. So at the moment, we've been talking to different people from all over the world. As you saw, recently we spoke to some people from Panama. I was talking to people from China before that, group of young ladies from Turkey, from Holland, and from Germany as well. And the thing that they all have in common is they understand this is one, it's an exciting event, but they had a sense of the deep profoundness of it and what this could represent if we see white smoke coming out of that chimney tonight. I was talking to a group from the United States as well, actually, not on air, off air, and they were saying their students here and their flight is going back tomorrow. So they were saying selfishly, they said, we want to see white smoke tonight before we have to get back on the plane. They said as Catholics, it would be so upsetting for them if they had to fly back tomorrow and they realized that while they were in the air, smoke was coming out of that chimney. But for just now, as the crowds continue to come up and wait, we'll hand it back to you, Monsi.
Thanks so much, Colin. Well, it is a little nerve-wracking here because we're watching the chimney, but at the same time, the crowd, if you can hear them clapping, they start to make these noises and they start to clap and woo-woo, and it makes you feel like you're missing something, so you nervously go back and look at the chimney. But I think that just shows why this is so important, and we're going to see this. If the ballots continue to burn black, which they might, you're going to see this over and over and over again, this anticipation continuing to heighten. Well, let's go on and talk about someone else who I think is pretty famous, Cardinal Grech. Famous for the role that he played in the Synod on Synodality. Hannah, you were one of the reporters that was there every single day for a month-long process that repeated over 2 years, and the much-anticipated reports that the new Holy Father will have to deal with that are coming in June. What can you tell us about the Cardinal?
Yeah, well, he came from a place not far from here, right, Malta, and has risen to a lot of prominence, especially for us journalists who have gotten to see him in many, many press conferences and across the Synod. You know, as the head of the Secretariat for the Synod, he was the leader for so many parts of that, which, as you said, the Synod on Synodality especially, you know, went over years, and so he continues to be important in that respect as well.
And he would have been well known to the Curia too, as someone who's part of a process that's really birthed here and convened here. How much do you think that matters?
Well, as far as continuing Pope Francis's idea of synodality and its importance in the church, he was obviously very on message and really in line with Pope Francis in that area. So if that's what the Cardinals are looking for someone who can continue that legacy in the church, then he would be a good candidate.
Well, we don't think that he necessarily checks any of the other boxes, though. That's really one candidate that sits in the box of synodality, but doesn't really cross any of the other issues that were discussed in the general congregations. Matthew, what's your experience thinking about and analyzing?
It's not a very big Episcopal conference, it's just a couple of bishops, but it was a very broad understanding of it. So that, in some ways, was the first indication that the future Cardinal Grech was very much on the program with Pope Francis.
Can you describe for our listeners and viewers the Amoris Laetitia document?
Yeah, well, specifically, obviously, this was a vast apostolic exhortation on family life. And it's a pity in many ways that Chapter 8 has become so controversial, because in that chapter, especially some footnotes, we've always joked that this is a pontificate of footnotes. Pope Francis discussed the possibility of a pastoral understanding of those couples who are divorced and remarried without an annulment, civil remarriage without an annulment, and is there a path for them to go back to receive communion? And obviously it was immensely controversial at the time. It remains one of the most controversial moments in the pontificate. So Cardinal Grech was soon brought to Rome and put in charge of the Synod of Bishops at exactly the time that Pope Francis really was reimagining the Synod of Bishops to have a much broader and significantly enhanced role in the life of the Church. And he has, I think, to his credit, certainly executed Francis's vision in that regard, especially in the implementation and the holding of the two synods on synodality, which was a multi-year process. So he demonstrates a capacity for organization. Some would question how well organized the Instrumentum Laboris was heading into it. I know you had the poor soul, you had to cover this and write about it. But then how the synod itself was conducted, there are obviously varying opinions on how successful he was in that. But as a presence who knows a lot of people and who is known by a lot of people, Cardinal Grech does check those boxes.
Monsignor Landry, I'm really keenly aware of the fact that because of the events of the last couple of days and what we're waiting for right now, you have audience members, listeners, faithful who don't really know what church teaching is around those who are civilly divorced, not annulled, or married in the church, divorced, etc. Can you clarify that, just in case there's someone who does come to church or doesn't feel welcome at church or longs for the Eucharist?
There are multiple points of confusion that we can take on one at a time. First, just simply being divorced does not cut someone off for Holy Communion. If you were the cause of the divorce, a good confession might be in order. If you were the victim of a divorce, you have not lost the capacity to receive Holy Communion. There are many who are mistaken about that. For somebody who is in a state of divorce where his or her husband or wife is still alive, so still bound by the promises made to be married until death do they part, they would need to be free to marry somebody else in the church for them to continue to be able to receive Holy Communion. And so if they attempt, is the church's word, a civil remarriage without a declaration of nullity, they're making a very public act that's contrary to the teaching of the church, and they are, in those circumstances, still very much encouraged to come to Mass, still to pray, but they're no longer living the commitment that they made when they were sacramentally married. And we know as Catholics that the Mass is a spousal sacrament in which Jesus, the bridegroom of the church, gives himself to his bride, the church, and that would be contradicted by that second remarriage, which Jesus himself, not just his church, but Jesus says in the gospel is tantamount to adultery. So in those circumstances, they cannot come and receive Holy Communion, but they're still very much a beloved member of the church. They're invited to come. We pray for some type of resolution, and the church always encourages in those circumstances not to be afraid to seek an annulment, because that church tribunal may determine that something necessary for a valid marriage was missing. Maybe there wasn't an openness to children. Maybe there was some type of major psychological block that was there. Who knows? The church pastorally wants to accompany everybody in these circumstances, but sometimes the individuals need to be courageous enough to trust in the Lord and give that a shot. About 90% of those couples in the United States that look into the validity of their first marriage get an outcome in which the church sees that something essential for marriage was missing. And then when they receive that declaration of nullity, they can approach their pastor, prepare for marriage, and then marry in the church and be restored to full communion. I have had the chance as a pastor of 2 parishes to accompany over 100 people on that journey. And it's so beautiful after somebody has faithfully persevered in the faith without receiving Holy Communion after 10, 12, sometimes 30 years to be able to receive Jesus anew. It's so much more powerful for them even than their first Holy Communion.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful to watch. For me personally, it was beautiful to experience the embrace of the church after that moment. And for a lot of people, they wonder, is it expensive? Oh, it takes too long. How did annulments change under this last pontificate?
So Pope Francis simplified the whole processes for an annulment, and he emphasized that annulment should be free. Now, in the United States, I know that not every diocese has gotten that memo. Somehow the tribunal staff has got to be paid, and I've been scandalized, to be blunt, by some dioceses and archdioceses who charge money for annulments, sometimes $750 and then others. It's not thousands of dollars. I've seen that in other countries in the world, but Pope Francis once wanted very much to say that the church is there to help you. We're not trying to make money to pay for overhead or things like that, and that was his emphasis. The second is he created a new process, which was a very brief process when the church is able to see right off the bat that something essential was obviously missing. And in circumstances like that, rather than the typical year-and-a-half process, which is average in the church for this investigation, it could be done within a few months much more clearly. Many others could receive what we call a form case annulment, not to get too much into the weeds, but if a Catholic marries outside the church without the bishop's permission, that marriage is invalid from the start. It is not a situation in which Jesus Christ is joining us to somebody else. And so for somebody who was engaged in that and suffered divorce thereafter, all you'd need to do is produce some documents, baptismal certificates, marriage certificates, final divorce decrees, etc., and a little bit of paperwork, and then the church can declare summarily that there was an annulment, that marriage was null from the beginning, and then the person would be free to marry someplace else.
Well, I hope that any bishops listening do take that to heart, knowing that sometimes the obstacles which are temporal really shouldn't be obstacles for what someone is trying to do in embracing church teaching and really receiving the greatest thing in the world, which is Jesus Christ in the Eucharist. Colum is ready and wants to share a little bit more with us about what he's hearing and what he's personally feeling too, and then we'll go back to our discussion on Cardinal Grech. Colum, what are you seeing?
Monsignor, I'm after bumping into a gentleman here, but he's scooting. He's on a scooter.
Yes.
It's difficult to scoot in this crowd.
Now, yes, but if you go over there at the crowd, there is a little bit. Yes, it's
so
opening.
Then you're running. So you're Italian, you're a Catholic. What do you think of what's happening at the moment, this moment in history?
We are waiting for the new Pope,
yes.
The election of the new Pope.
How do you feel?
I feel amazing. I'm waiting for it.
And are you surprised by how many people are here watching that chimney?
No, I'm not surprised.
You're not surprised?
Every time is like this.
It's like
very
this.
crowded, yes, every time.
Isn't it amazing? It shows you just how powerful the church is to touch people all over the world, to come here to witness this moment.
Yes, because Pope and...
Well, I think we lost audio like we were saying. There is tough connectivity issues. There's so many people here. Again,
well,
I blame the Starlinks.
Because of the security, the dampening
That's
the
true.
security across this entire area as part of the security for the conclave. The reality is many of us up here, for example,
we don't have cell connection. Yeah, we cannot talk to our families right now.
Well, as long as we can connect with all of you. But that security, I mean, it's going to be rough a couple of days for people who wander into this part of the world. And I have the feeling that probably by the end of the night, Colum will be in the Piazza Navona talking to
with some gelato. I
with
hope.
some gelato.
Some really, really good gelato. Well, I mean, our discussion on Cardinal Grech, I think, led us into a beautiful teaching moment, a catechetical moment, especially, again, I have a heart for this. I think it's really important for people to know that the church loves them and wants to embrace them, and that there are opportunities for them to encounter their priest. If you don't get a good answer there, go to your bishop. He should be receiving you with open arms. So, back to Cardinal Grech.
Yes.
When we think about him and what was discussed, the idea of synodality, sure, but someone who can run Vatican affairs, someone who can be the face of the church to evangelize and communicate the church with the world. This 69-year-old cardinal, do I have his age right? I believe so. Does he check those boxes?
He was a very successful parish priest and bishop of the smaller island in Malta. So there are two islands in Malta, the main island, and then Gozo is the second island. Malta is an incredibly Catholic place. There are gorgeous churches everywhere. The people are faithful, including to daily mass in high numbers. And so it's a circumstance that somewhat makes it easier for parish priests and bishops when there are so many faithful practicing. And he had the reputation for being the bishop of the two bishops there, far more aligned with Pope Benedict when he was named than the bishop on the other island. And so Pope Francis persuaded him to come here and head up the synod. And most of the people who knew him as the Bishop of Gozo were a little bit surprised with some of the positions he's taken since he's come here, because he had a reputation of being far more conservative than his being progressive here as the head of the synod. And so he has a good pastoral reputation from his past as a pastor and a bishop in Gozo.
You know, the very question of synodality, which, as we know, has been a fraught topic for a number of years now, where it's almost difficult even to define today what exactly it is. So Cardinal Grech And I would add to that Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich of Luxembourg. Those two are tied intimately together in terms of the Synod on Synodality. He is essentially the face of the Synod on Synodality now that Pope Francis is no longer with us. That is a source of encouragement for some in the college, but for others who have been concerned with the direction of the Synod, but also how it's going to be implemented, I think that could prove something of a deficit for him.
Hannah, what can you tell us about Cardinal Hollerich and the way that he could be providing some support for Cardinal Grech, even just a little bit of background on him in general, just in case our audience doesn't know him very well?
Right, so he's the only cardinal and archbishop of Luxembourg, a very small country in Europe. So he wasn't, I would say, so well known, although he has taken on leadership roles within the European bishops, and so he's had some visibility that way. But the Synod for him became as well a very important moment, as he was given one of the most important jobs by Pope Francis himself as the relator. So he had a very important as well speaking role to all those who participated in the Synod. So he would, at the beginning of each week of the most recent monthly meeting, he would provide an introduction. This is what we're going to discuss this week. Here are sort of the ground rules. Obviously, he, spoke a lot to media as well, was answering questions that we had about the process as it was ongoing and the different documents that were included. That has certainly risen his figure.
Well, what else can we add then about when you have a backer and what that looks like? To have Cardinal Hollerich kind of creating relationships and maybe making introductions that individuals that he encountered with the Synod. We know that Bishop Barron was explaining that he encountered 60 or so cardinals through that process. Might that be helpful to Cardinal Grech? Exactly.
So the Synod brought together cardinals from all over the world in these two different synods. Now, it was largely the same group for each year, but that is a very interesting group because it was fairly diverse. Pope Francis himself added a number of significant cardinals to that. The other aspect about Cardinal Hollerich that's worth noting is that he spent a great deal of time in Asia. He served in Japan and was closely tied to the Jesuit institutions there, being a Jesuit himself. That is a connection, I think, that can also benefit should he have chosen. We don't know who Cardinal Hollerich at the end of the day is going to be disguising his handwriting and picking to be the next pope in his ballot. But I think if there is this continuation of synodality, Cardinal Hollerich, who is very clearly invested in this, I think would see Cardinal Grech as one of the best options for continuing it in exactly the mode that Pope Francis wanted.
And that's not necessarily something that we've seen expressed as a desire in these general congregations. We heard a lot of a desire for continuity of all three pontificates, but Cardinal Czerny, in an interview that I think was quite popular in the Italian press and then in global press, saying we want a successor to the seat of Peter, not necessarily a successor to Pope Francis. Right, Monsignor Landry?
That's the way it always has to be. As a factual matter, he will be the successor of Francis and all the popes all the way back to Peter. There's been this transmission of the keys, apostolic succession, tracing all the way back to the upper room, tracing all the way back to Caesarea Philippi when Jesus promised those keys to Peter. What I think's important to talk about with Cardinal Grech with regard to the 62 cardinals who were members of the Synod is not every one of those cardinals was an enthusiastic supporter of the Synod. And so even though they were all there and got to know him, many were resistant to some of what was going on in the Synod, and for that reason, Cardinal Grech might be among the most unpopular figures.
Well, we'll see. I think we won't know. We will. And whatever it is that someone tells us, hopefully won't get them excommunicated, since we know that's the penalty for talking about the conclave and the goings-on within it, even in the general congregations. Well, let's talk about another candidate that's less well-known, but that has come up quite a few times in these conversations, and that's Cardinal Lopez Romero. Although we can say his name in Spanish, he's not necessarily from Spain. Talk to us about him, Matthew.
Well, that's right. So he is in his 70s. He is a cardinal from Catalan, so he has that Spanish connection. He's a Salesian. Mm-hmm. He has served in South America, so he has the direct connection with Latin America. And then he was sent, of all places, to Rabat in Morocco to serve. and has really established himself as somebody who, in much the same way that Cardinal Jean-Marc Arborelius in Marseille, is somebody who spans almost the whole of the Mediterranean. So that includes Spain, it includes, of course, North Africa, down into sub-Saharan Africa, but a little less than one would think. And then, of course, into southern Europe, into France and into Italy. So that area, that geographical area, would likely be one of the bases for his support, especially his connections to Latin America in his time there.
So he does check that box of ethnicity, diversity, and understanding different cultures, bringing to the table an understanding of the East as well, which we know was discussed many, many times. The Eastern churches wanting representation, but also as a bit of a passion project that Pope Francis brought forward, and we saw it certainly reflected in his funeral. What would you add, Monsignor Landry?
Well, he brings the experience of 3 different continents, his serving for 20 years as a missionary in Paraguay, and then going back and heading the Salesians in Honduras. The Latin Americans know they're not going to get another Latin American. So what they're really hoping for is somebody with great Latin American experience so that they can bring the needs, they can bring the hopes of those in Latin America to the See of St. Peter, just like Jorge Maria Bergoglio had. And so he is one who checks in big, thick, bold marker that continental hope. I think also he's one of many Salesian cardinals. And so when there have been questions made of other Salesian cardinals, like, for example, Cardinal Angel Fernandez Artim, when people have been sort of trying to prop him up as a potential candidate for the papacy, he says, no, I'm supporting another Salesian. And he's trying to prop up his brother. And so there are a lot of Salesian cardinals. Part of that goes back not just to St. John Bosco, the founder of the Salesians, but also to Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, who was here as a Salesian, as a Secretary of State, who was at least availing himself of the skills of a lot of other Salesians, putting them in places of success, mentioning them in these areas so that they would be able to be spotted, placed into these sees that could then become cardinalatial. And so the Cardinal Rabat is giving lots of interviews. When a lot of other people were tight-lipped over the course of this week, he was regularly giving Spanish interviews and compelling interviews, in a sense, from his experience. This is a person who's clearly a disciple of Jesus Christ. He looks like a Christian. He walks like a Christian. He talks like a Christian. And it's made people wonder whether he could be the successor of St. Peter, because he does come from the peripheries. Just his 20 years in Paraguay and then Honduras would be bringing the real concerns of indigenous and poor people, much like Pope Francis did, but not from a place like Buenos Aires, but from the places of the Guarani.
Yes, and I think that does play a really significant role when you're thinking about what he'll bring to the table, the kind of connections he'll be able to make with other cardinals, and how he'll be able to really be a place to receive the needs that we know all cardinals come with. When that person switches from being my brother cardinal to the Holy Father, they're going to try to make that connection. Hannah, as a member of the press, have you experienced that and seen that openness on his behalf?
Sure. I'm sorry. I'm just a little distracted about the young people.
The young people are yelling. It's
There's
loud.
young people walking by the set, and they're excited to be here. No, I mean, of course, that transition from cardinal to pope, there has to be that switch from the leader of a particular church to the leader of the universal church, right? So that's an important step, and it'll be interesting to see whoever is elected, how they make that step.
And they'll be qualified by the Holy Spirit in cooperation with the Holy Spirit if they're prayerful.
Yeah, so it's one of the fun things to ponder, what name different cardinals might take if they became pope. One of the names, for example, with Cardinal Jean Arborelius of Marseille, is that were he elected pope, it's been assumed that he would take John the 24th because he looks kind of like John. I say that because it is assumed almost that he probably wouldn't, but were Lopez Romero to be elected pope, everyone in their minds would think this is Francis II. And I say that because he embodies so many of the different aspects of the Francis pontificate. The focus on the Mediterranean, the focus on migration. He has dealt with that himself. he is in the Mediterranean, so he's very familiar with the crisis at Lampedusa, for example. When Pope Francis made his first trip, it was to the island of Lampedusa, where thousands of migrants have died trying to reach. He is somebody who is also very much concerned with the environment, with climate change. He's Laudato Si. He is also somebody who sees the importance of synodality. He has spoken very favorably of it. And he represents, I think, this vision of continuity with the Francis pontificate. So those who would be supporting him would see that as one of the biggest reasons to support him, to continue the Francis vision for the church.
As a missionary church with big pastoral outreach, but also, I would say, particularly because of where he is and where he's from, an understanding of interreligious dialogue, especially around issues with Islam and Muslim-majority countries.
He has spoken publicly that Pope Francis appointed him as a cardinal for interreligious dialogue, and that Pope Francis appointed many cardinals precisely to be able to have that existential conversation. Interreligious dialogue is not just of words, or it's certainly not carried out mainly among theologians, but as Pope Benedict got the whole church moving in this direction, he said it's carried out by works of charity, it's carried out by this existential dialogue. He used to use the word caminar juntos in Spanish, that real interreligious dialogue begins with walking together, just sharing life together, recognizing the humanity in each other, etc. And so Lopez Romero is somebody who has been making that journey for many years, believes in it, and wants the church moving ahead to be able to do that more concertedly.
Well, he's also a cardinal with a beard, and we'll have a conversation about bearded cardinals in a second. We're all sitting here waiting. It's now been over 2 hours, which in my mind gives enough time for a lengthy exhortation. 133, I'm doing the math in my head on how long it takes for them to deliver their ballot, and then for the scrutineers to come in and do their job. So hopefully we're getting close. But
don't forget the revisers.
The revisers, right. We check it, and then we check it again. And we still haven't confirmed whether we're having an infirmari take part or not, which I'm sure we'll be able to maybe suss out. Maybe Hannah can figure that out for us.
We didn't see any of the cardinals needing assistance today, which I
thought
was...
That's right. In the procession or
that's
in professing their oath. So that's very true. Thank you so much, Dr. Bunsen. But let's go out to Column and see if this anticipation has, a couple of people kind of just feeling that. But before we do that, I think it is important for us to reflect on the spirituality of these men with a little bit of a different angle. Cardinal Grech, and I would say because of the issue of synodality and the listening, would have carried on that spirit of interreligious dialogue as you were mentioning it, that was so important to Pope Francis, but made some people uncomfortable. How secure do people have to be in their faith, and how clear do they have to be in communicating it in order to be able to engage in this interreligious dialogue? I spent 15 years of my life defending religious freedom, but very clearly understanding that that isn't about where the faiths come together, but really about where the faiths differ and strengthening each other in those differences rather than trying to find places that water down our religious beliefs.
So we need to make a very important distinction about what faith is. Faith is first and foremost a trust in someone on the basis of which you trust in what that person has said and done. So for us as Catholics, we trust in Jesus Christ, and therefore, because of that trust, we believe in the resurrection, as he said in his conversation with Martha and Mary after Lazarus' death. Because we trust in Jesus, we believe in what he says about the Eucharist, as happened in Capernaum. When a Catholic has that type of trust in Jesus, the person might not be the smartest potential theologian in carrying on conversations about God 1 verses 3, which is a common conversation that Catholics would have, for example, with Muslims. But if somebody really deeply believes in Jesus, then they can have the dialogue of charity, they can have the dialogue of friendship, they can just give witness to the massive impact his own friendship with Christ, or her own friendship, makes in life, which is one of the most powerful ways to share the faith. If somebody likewise knows the content of the faith, like a Dr. Matthew Bunsen, then you're able to have conversations that are far more theological and start to poke holes. For example, again, if we're continuing the conversation about Muslims, about how the Quran was put together, about the lack of real scrutiny for some of the things that are in there about the internal contradiction that you'll find there. But you don't have to know the Christian faith well enough to engage in that type of conversation. I remember the joke of the stubborn Irishman having a conversation in a bar, and he's getting basically killed in forensic debating points. But at the end, he just slams down his pint and he says, "You may have all the arguments, but you're still wrong." Because he knew Jesus, who has risen from the dead and accompanies him in life, and eventually he'll discover, if he works at it, the types of arguments that would be the proper retort.
And personal conviction really does matter. That really is the best communicator of the faith, which is one of the reasons why you want that personal witness and fire, that consuming fire, to be shared. And you want the person leading the church to have that inside of them so that they can preach and engage others in this way. Interreligious dialogue then becomes a little tricky when you're trying to figure out who's who among these candidates.
It does very much. And someone like Lopez Romero was a big supporter, as we all have been saying, of Pope Francis, in particular in the area of interreligious dialogue as it pertains to one of the other side projects. It was still a major project, the idea of fraternity. When you read Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli Tutti, aside from it being extremely long, it really was trying to frame the question of finding an idea of fraternity for the globe that moved almost beyond typical theological categories that can become a hindrance to interreligious dialogue. That opened him up to some criticism from those who see this as the complaint that we are not an NGO, that we are a church and we have to proclaim the church. Now, that's a criticism that some rejected, that no, this is Pope Francis's way of bringing people first to the table to get to know them, to see them in a way that is honest and fraternal. But clarity is often needed. And they talk about the fact that if you're going to have a conversation with someone, you still have to know what you're talking about, and you have to be clear to them about what you know and believe, or there's an inherent kind of dishonesty in a conversation you're having.
Hannah, in your reporting, when you think about the Francis pontificate, and obviously the point of this isn't to be negative, but did that seeming lack of clarity or reported lack of clarity make your job more difficult?
Well, it certainly didn't make it easier. We could put it that way. It's funny, reporting on the Vatican is so particular, let's say, because of all of the knowledge it sort of requires. You have documents coming out that mean you're reading canon law, that changes that the Pope has put into effect, or theological documents, pastoral speeches of the... So I will say it's been interesting and fun in a way too, to get to learn from those things, and we reach out to experts as well, of course, to help us. For sure, interpreting Francis sometimes was difficult, so we relied obviously on experts to help us and our own knowledge of him and everything he's said before, but that was one challenge that we've had.
How has reporting on the Vatican changed or affected your personal faith?
Well, that's a big question. I think for me personally, and I think other journalists might say other things, so I just want to speak for myself, but being close to the heart of the church has been incredibly moving and inspiring. And through this job, we also get to meet so many incredibly inspiring Catholics. So it's not just the really important people, the red hats that we're talking about today, for example, but plenty of ordinary Catholics, priests, religious, who are just doing amazing work for the Lord. So I've just taken immense inspiration from them. Sure, on the other hand, we also get to see up close a lot of the maybe other dirtier sides of the Vatican and the church and bureaucracy and things that go on, disagreements. But I guess I've just relied then on prayer as well to separate that from, Monsignor Landry said, the person that we are following, right? And how that differs from the institution.
Absolutely. Well, you did some reporting on the Vatican Bank, the Institute of the IOR. I know, I'm listening to the clapping and I'm looking because I keep thinking that something is happening, but I cannot trust the crowd. I must trust the camera. Anyway, you have
Trust the
seagulls. You have done some incredible reporting on the Vatican Bank, on the Cardinal Becciu movements, the trial, etc.
Asked Becciu to come to him and said, this is not okay, and here's what's happening about it. So it's been interesting in the years that followed. Pope Francis himself sort of, we say, rehabilitated the cardinal. I think it was Pope Francis's, extremely characteristic mercy that he wanted to show towards everyone, that he would still be willing to dialogue. And I think he had a dinner one Holy Thursday with the Cardinal Vichu. The Cardinal did try to say now in the lead up that, no, I can still participate in the election. But then as the next days went on, we saw that, no, it was very clear that that initial decision by Pope Francis that he would lose those rights and privileges was still standing.
And so that's how we stayed with 133 instead of 134. Well, let's talk about another potential candidate that also isn't as well known. We know Lopez Romero isn't someone that everyone has been hearing about in the press. There's our Cardinal Arborelius.
Yes.
I don't know how we're going to have that as a pope. Obviously, he changes his name, but that's going to be, it's like Bergoglio, right? Everyone's going to spell it wrong.
Yes, Anders Arborelius, I think he's 68, who is the Bishop of Stockholm, Sweden. But when I think of Cardinal Arborelius, I think of the fact that in some ways he is not just the cardinal in Sweden, but he is sort of the cardinal for all of Scandinavia.
Yeah.
Because obviously the Catholic Church is tiny in that part of the world, but he is somebody who looms very large in the church there. And he, for the record, let's remember that he was appointed by Pope Francis.
That's
that
right.
matters because he is a Carmelite. He is one of the experts. He is deeply respected for his spirituality. He has done quite a few things for EWTN over the years as an expert, as a Carmelite, and he brings that brilliant spiritual perspective. He is also a convert. He converted to Catholicism in 1968, and so he brings that perspective as well. And as the Bishop of Stockholm, he is somebody who is witnessing a kind of transformation of culture in Sweden. The problems and challenges of migration, both positively and negatively. Positively in the sense that the demographic changes are significant, but that means that the Catholic population is increasing, especially people migrating from Eastern Europe. Then there are the demographic shifts that are happening, the rise of a Muslim community there that some argue is somewhat destabilizing culturally for the Swedes. He has to reconcile that. He has to deal with that on a regular basis. I think one of the handicaps he has is that he is not that well known outside of Europe. But those who know him have an abiding respect for him. And I think they could look to him as a potential compromise candidate in a deadlock conclave.
One of the things that he's had to deal with significantly, especially being the primary voice in that area of the world, are the issues of life. Abortion, contraception, euthanasia, which is so prevalent in that area of the world, and he has been an important voice there. How much would you say that matters in these discussions? It wasn't necessarily something that came up as a feature in the general congregations, but it did come up in a way, and kind of some people alluded to it as that being part of the discussion on the continuity of the teachings of the importance of the body and life, etc.
I would doubt that any one of the 133 electors is not pro-life. With regard to the articulation of some of the Church's teachings in sexuality, in the Church, including in the College of Cardinals, you'll see the vast majority will treat all the teachings of the Church as part of the good news. There'll be a few who are ashamed of the gospel, a few who will treat it as bad news. He is one who's had tremendous experience in Scandinavia, not just believing, but articulating the Church's truth in these areas as part of that liberating reality that Christ has given to us so that we can be truly free to love according to the truth. And so he'd bring that to the papacy, not quite as much as a 58-year-old cardinal from Krakow did in 1978, but he's had to defend and advance the Church's teachings in some areas that are occasionally unpopular, especially with secularists in a secular society. And he's done so because of the integrity of his life, that he is someone who is taken seriously because it's not just words for him. His conversion happened from Lutheranism because he read St. Therese. In her little way and her discovery of her own vocation to be love in the heart of the Church captivated him. And he recognized that that was the truth. And he made the heroic step in order to become a Catholic. That, number one, for him is super important. Second is he really takes the new evangelization seriously. And so in the church, when we talk about sharing our faith, we talk about it in three contexts. The first is what I'm in charge of for the Church in the United States of America through the Pontifical Mission Societies, what we call mission to the nations. What Jesus talked about, there are 5.5 billion people out of the 8 billion alive who don't know Jesus Christ and don't know a believer in Jesus Christ. That's part of our assignment. But then second, there are many Christians who have given up the practice of the faith. They're baptized and fled. That's the new evangelization, the reproposal of the joy of the gospel to these folks. He's an expert in that, and he's a practitioner. And the third is, how do you form people better to know and live their faith, those who are practicing, who have never left? That's what John Paul II called the pastoral care of the faithful. He likewise, for the small church in Stockholm, has been superb there too, as our friend the narcissist seagull comes back into the picture.
He wants to be in every shot. Well, I want to stick on that point of conversion, particularly from other denominations, because we saw that shift in the United States with the creation of the ordinariate, right? That welcoming some of that dialogue to bring in a lot of the members of other traditions that really longed for that communion with the Catholic Church. So how significant is that, knowing that that really is a place of momentum for the church in the new evangelization, or drop the new, just say evangelization?
Yeah, and we saw record numbers of converts this Easter. So there's a movement that is happening. And you're seeing the rejection of so many aspects of modern culture, of modernity. And people are being drawn to the beauty. Bishop Barron always uses the phrase, he used it today, truth and beauty of the church.
Yes.
So the proper liturgy, the appeal of the spirituality, somebody who comes across someone like Therese of Lisieux or Teresa of Avila or John of the Cross and wants to know more because this is what they've been searching for. Cardinal Arborelius, I think, understands that very well in such a hyper-secularized culture as we have in Scandinavia. So he would bring, I think, a certain perspective on how to bring that certainly to the rest of Europe, certainly to the rest of the so-called developed world. But I think he would also have appeal to the other elements, the other places in the church, precisely because he can understand what it means to be a minority as a Catholic, but also as somebody who has himself worked through this process of conversion. One other note about Cardinal Arborelius is that in the wake of the German synodal path, he's been one of those bishops who has really led the charge, arguing against the lack of clarity and the real dangers that the German synodal way poses to the rest of the church. So coming as a voice out of the north, I think he has certainly left his mark among many faithful Catholics as a beacon of hope.
From that pastoral perspective, I think it's quite obvious that someone who has experienced a coming into the church in his mature age, right, not as a child, someone who has chosen the faith, will be able to communicate it in a very different way, and so will be dear to some people in a way that he wouldn't be dear, or the Pope wouldn't be dear to someone who's a cradle Catholic, or again in a different way. We talk about these communities that some of the cardinals come from, the Salesians, Carmelites, that Elijah spirituality. How do those allegiances or those places of belonging in the church affect a conclave?
Well, if you're a Jesuit, you've got lots of Jesuits there. You've got a couple Dominicans. You have many Salesians. As far as I know, he's the only Carmelite.
That's right.
But there are many who have been impacted by the Carmelites. I mentioned St. Therese Lisieux. Half the cardinals have fallen in love with St. Therese over the course of their following their vocation. She taught them how to receive God's love and how to reciprocate that love. And so people are going to be able to relate to him that way. St. John Paul II was, of course, a diocesan priest. But spiritually, he was a Carmelite. He had written his doctorate on St. John of the Cross, and he always considered himself as one possessing a Carmelite soul. And so you'll find his biography would have lots of traction with a lot of the other cardinals, and they're going to look to a Carmelite expert really as a teacher of the interior cartography. How do we advance into the interior castle that Jesus is trying to make within us, the Carmelites have been the great doctors of that, and I think everybody would be looking to a Pope Arborelius, if he were to emerge, as someone who would be able to lead the whole church in prayer, which is one of the most important characteristics of the successor of Peter.
And something that has been mentioned so many times in the general congregations, and that is really a point of unity for the cardinals. They want someone who prays.
That's right. You also mentioned, and I think you've raised a topic that has not been much discussed, covered in the ramp up to this conclave, and that is the presence of religious orders and congregations. There are approximately about 30 plus cardinals in this conclave who belong to different communities, from the Jesuits to the Salesians to the Franciscans, different branches of the Franciscans, the Dominicans. Here we have a Carmelite. One of the questions that is asked is, after having a Jesuit pope, is there going to be a return
That's right.
To not having one, or is the door open now for potential members of these different communities? We talked about Piero Battista Pizzaballa. He's a Franciscan. Angel Fernandez Artim, he's a Salesian. So is it now quite possible? Now, in the history of the church, we've had quite a few Franciscans. We had only one Jesuit. We've had Dominicans. That's an interesting question, I think, that no one really has pondered, and I mean, we'll get the answer to it. But Pope Francis certainly appointed quite a few members from these communities, in part because I think his own lived experience as a Jesuit opened him to the potential advantages to the church of having that perspective.
And understanding how to live faith in community.
Yes, and so he thinks that we can all learn from the way that those in religious orders live the evangelical counsels, that all of us, in one way or the other, in the middle of the world, are supposed to unite ourselves to Jesus in his poverty, in his chastity, in his obedience. But I would also say that with regard to Pope Francis, he intentionally left the diocesan seminary. He didn't originally enter as a Jesuit postulant novice, and he was turned off because a faculty member in his diocesan seminary basically said, "You're really smart, Jorge, so think clearly, but speak obtusely." In other words, don't let anybody know what you really think. And this young Argentine just said, that's not coming from above. And so he was looking for another form of spirituality, and many of us as diocesan priests looking at Pope Francis, whereas he never once criticized his Jesuit brothers, he was somewhat unrelenting in his criticism of diocesan priests and seminarians in general. And so there is a desire for diocesan priests, in the typical diocesan bishop who's not religious, to be able to examine whether there was a misunderstanding of where the meat and potatoes are served to the hungry mystical body of the church in parishes, whether there was a little bit of a gap in the type of understanding that might be able to be remedied by the next Holy Father.
Now, before we go into talking about another candidate, Hannah, I do want to ask you about the digital side of the papacy. This was very new. Coming into the Francis pontificate, you did have some of the church online, but 2013 was a little bit of a watershed moment of the Twitter Pope, now X, right? Instagram really coming up and ramping up, the meta universe, where TikTok is a place where you can evangelize. And you've certainly reported on the impact of the TikTok priests or the TikTok preachers, the like dance-offs, you know, with religious communities where they'll hand a dance to each other. How has that created an opportunity? And would you expect that the next Holy Father would be judged based on his ability to communicate with someone who's a member of the press?
Sure. It's kind of hard to turn back the clock, I think, exactly with where Pope Francis has gone. He was unique, especially for the way that he wanted to engage directly with the press. I mean, especially some of my colleagues who have been reporting on, you know, also his predecessors. Before, the Pope was very much mediated by his spokesperson, who was there to answer the questions and kind of speak for him to journalists. And Pope Francis didn't care for that. He just went around that entirely and would speak directly to journalists, give interviews in a way that was absolutely unprecedented.
When you think about how little we saw Matteo Bruni during the papacy and how much we saw of Pope Francis, did that create an expectation then where journalists might be disappointed if the pontificate goes back to this kind of very ordered understanding? Or is it going to make your job a little easier and more stable? Will you get more nights at home?
Fewer surprise interviews maybe could be possible. Certainly, while the Pope was very available to media, he was also very controlling of the information. So in some ways, yes, he shared a lot in the press and in his various ways. And in other ways, there were a lot of questions that sometimes journalists had that were hard to get answers or hard to get clarity towards. Even when the Pope himself would say something that would be like, what does he mean there? Let's ask Matteo Bruni if we can have some understanding, like, what did the Pope mean when he said these words? Did he mean this? Did he mean that? And unfortunately, it was very hard to get the clarity that we often really wanted, especially I know as a Catholic journalist, we wanted to give that clarity even to our readers and our listeners and viewers, and sometimes it just was not possible. So I personally hope that the new Pope will be a little bit more available in that way, that he'll be willing to sort of, maybe even make corrections about what he says if he needs to, and let that information flow as much as possible and give us as much transparency as possible.
I know that's something that was brought up in an interview that Cardinal Sacco gave to EWTN, where he said we really need a catechist. We need someone who is going to explain the faith. And for us, I would say for our team, that's something where we really had to double down to add in that extra line of, and the church teaches ABC, right? Where the catechetical function of news has been plugged in a very different way and created a discipline for us that we otherwise wouldn't have had to deploy, but that I think is important and sets us aside in reporting on stories, but at the same time giving people the context that they need to be able to receive those stories with clarity and without some of that confusion. All right, one more name, and I'm going to say it wrong. Gujrati, which one of you is right?
Gujrati.
Gujrati is right.
Gujrati, okay. Well, Cardinal Gujrati, what can you tell us about his background, how well known he is, how much of a contender is he really?
Cardinal Claudio Gujrati is the prefect emeritus of the dicastery for Eastern churches. He's been in the Vatican's diplomatic corps. He's served very ably in Ukraine among one of his assignments. But prior to that, he had worked as an official at the then Congregation for Eastern Churches. So he's somebody who's a Latin Rite prelate who understands the Eastern churches almost better than anybody in the Latin Rite. And so those who, as we were talking about before, might want an Eastern Patriarch to be able to bring their needs, he would be probably the best next option for those coming from the East, to have someone who would really deeply understand them. He would understand likewise the situation of war-torn countries, having served there in Ukraine after the invasion of Crimea in 2014. He, as we were able to see earlier during the Novum Diales, was a very capable preacher, very much influenced by the wisdom of the great saints and doctors of the church from the East. And that would be an incredible contribution to this big petition as we get closer to the year 2054, which would be the 1000th anniversary of the lamentable split of the church of the East from the West. He would be somebody capable of at least verbally and prayerfully bridging that gap, in the hope that Jesus' prayer from the Last Supper, that we might be one just as he and the Father are one by the power of the Holy Spirit, would be able to come about, so that, as Jesus himself said on Holy Thursday, so that the world might know that the Father sent Jesus and that the Father loves us just like he loves Jesus. That would be the great asset of a cardinal like Claudio Gujrati.
Hannah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that another area where Gujrati could contribute, and was mentioned during the general congregations, was another important anniversary coming up this year, the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea.
That's right.
That was brought up specifically among the cardinals, and that's another area where I think his contribution could be really important.
And where the Pope will be coming out right into that anniversary. It's May 20th, where this moment of reflection will begin, and an opportunity for dialogue in a way that the Church really hasn't seen in a very long time. So it is significant, and also sharing Easter. When you think about what we shared, that coming together, I always think of the children who can, with their friends, celebrate one Easter rather than, oh, that week's your turn and now it's my turn next week, and I guess we'll have two, gatherings at home, and we'll go to yours and then we'll go to mine. I mean, that must be challenging, and there must be kind of a desire for relief where the Church can come back together and have that unity.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we're looking at boxes to tick, he ticks several of them. The first, of course, is canon law. He has considerable experience in the area of canon law, especially as a Vatican diplomat. But he is also somebody who has an understanding of voices in the Church that aren't often heard. For example, the 23 churches of the Eastern Catholic churches. They have certainly been a big priority in the life of the Church since the Second Vatican Council. Not that they weren't before, but this is the voices that want to be heard, have been heard more, certainly under the pontificate of John Paul II, into Benedict, and now with Pope Francis. This was something that he was very concerned about, being deeply interested in Eastern spirituality himself. So those voices would be heard. Cardinal Gujrati would potentially also bring an awareness, as Monsignor was saying, of problems and crises and wars in the world.
Oh, yes.
As somebody who's been on the front lines of Vatican diplomacy and trying to solve them. So where some of the areas that some would wonder, limited pastoral experience, and he is, whether one likes it or not, he is very much a creature, so to speak, of the Secretariat of State and the Roman Curia. If there's a decision that they have confidence in an official who has worked in the Roman Curia, he'll meet all of your criteria. But those who would perhaps want a more pastoral vision of somebody who's been a residential bishop or archbishop, that would be something they would look at.
But he does check a lot of the boxes of interreligious dialogue. Like you said, that background in canon law. I found him interesting because of the number of languages that he speaks. He also does have an understanding, deep understanding of synodality, properly understood through the Eastern churches, right, in terms of the origins of synodality and the way that we understand them, rather than trying to bring that into the modern world in a new way. He would carry the tradition of it, which I do believe was Pope Francis's intent when he started that process and wanting us to have that encounter with the Eastern way of understanding dialogue and communal acceptance, listening, etc. That process is certainly something that comes from those roots and that understanding. He does, again, fit the diplomatic desire to have a little of the kind of official sense of the Church, and he certainly can preach. I mean, the three of us were sitting here listening to that homily going, wow.
He certainly knows how to get the Greek doctors and saints to make a message compelling. And that knowledge of where you find those types of fonts and being able to put them in one place. He showed a master class on consulting the great saints of a tradition that most Latin Rite priests and bishops and even the cardinals listening wouldn't have been aware of.
He checks the box of the Roman Curia.
That's right.
And he also checks that box of that continuity. When you think about how he does have the intellectual vigor of a Ratzinger, he does have that understanding of the world of a John Paul II, as well as a view of the Eastern churches for that Pope Francis was so known for.
Right. I'm going to guess, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure he's the only person throughout the whole Novum Dialis who quoted or referenced the doctor of the Church from Armenia, Gregory of Narek.
Yes!
With the Book of Lamentations, and it's beautiful stuff. So I think under that hypothetical pontificate, he would continue to unfold for the Church the treasures of Eastern Christianity. So that would be a huge bonus. The one problem that I think he has is that name recognition isn't there. And so the ability to heighten your profile, especially in the situation of the Novum Dialis, I think, to put it in these terms, I think many cardinals who saw his homily were very interested in what he had to say. I think they were very impressed. But is that enough, for example, to get you traction among cardinals where they're actually seriously contemplating you as Supreme?
Oh, here we go, black smoke. There it is. It looks black. Oh, we've lost the feed, and oh, here it is again. There it is, my friends, my family, EWTN family. We've got black smoke after a long, long time. It is 9 o'clock here in Rome. People in the square started lining up at 6 o'clock. They've been here for 3 hours. You can hear the crowd screaming. There was some clapping from, I think, exhaustion that it's finally come. And we know we can start to guess just how long this process is going to take. It's the first Fumata. It's the first smoke that we see in this historic moment for the church where we're all anticipating when we'll have white smoke.
As much as Italians were waiting for this moment to see smoke, I think they're waiting for their cena even more. And there are a lot of people hungry. 9 o'clock is a little later than the typical late Roman eating time.
And I'm guessing there are about 133 cardinals who have that same sentiment.
Absolutely. Take a look at that crowd. I mean, it's just incredible. People are very quickly leaving. I think it is because they're very hungry. But there was a moment right before we saw the smoke where all of the screens in the square went down. The anger, I thought we were going to have a revolt. There was anger here. Immediately I was like, wait, I'm so glad that we're up high, because people might go storming in anger because they cannot see the chimney and the famous seagull, which in a very smart way was not there when the smoke came out.
Now, one thing too is that this is a good demonstration. 133 ballots plus all the notes. That's a lot of smoke.
That's a lot of smoke.
So there will be no question when the day that we get white smoke, because if you're burning that many ballots, it'll be obvious.
I sure hope so. I don't want to get that wrong.
No, they also, and we should say, have a canister that augments the darkness of the smoke. That was an innovation in 2013. And I remember when we saw the white smoke on March 13th, 2013, I was asked on another network whether it was white. And I said, that smoke that came out earlier was so black that if we're not seeing white smoke now, it would make the exhaust from the smokestacks in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania during the Gilded Age pass Al Gore standards. And so it is always going to be clear whether we have black or white. Back in 2005, there was gray smoke coming on out, and it was confusing, which is one of the reasons why they put the chemicals in together with the burning ballots.
A really important difference, and I think also a great mercy. We're thinking about all of the different legacies that we have from certain popes. I would say the great mercy of not having to guess and not having a lack of certainty is certainly wonderful. Hannah, it's so wonderful to have you here as a part of our team. It's unusual to have you on TV for such a long time. I'm so grateful that you stuck with us, and we'll definitely have you back throughout the week. Hopefully it won't be too long before we see white smoke here. Everyone else is picking up, and I think we're all hungry too. So family, we're so grateful that you're here with us, that you're praying with us. We'll be back again tomorrow morning, because this is like rinse and repeat. There are the possibility for 4 ballots tomorrow, 2 moments of smoke, either at noon or in the afternoon around 6 p.m.-ish, hopefully. A little not as late, but it all depends.
We don't know how long it's going to be, but just for precision, in the first ballot, it's always going to take a little longer in each of the 2 sessions, because they'll be saying some words every time they put it in the receptacle. And so my guess is people would want to be tuning in with us at 11 o'clock our time, 5 o'clock on the East Coast, and then probably about 12:15, 12:30. But we'll start to get a rhythm tomorrow, which will be standard.
And the best thing to do, go on EWTN social media. We are everywhere you are. Of course, we're on radio, etc., but we want you to know exactly when this moment happens so that you can rejoice, as we will rejoice when we introduce you to the successor of the seat of Peter. Thank you so much for joining us. God bless you.
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.